In the third year of my clandestine romance with Marcus's son, he unexpectedly declared his engagement. I wasn't the one he was planning to marry. Some insiders felt bad for me, but Marcus gave a chilly smile and said, "If you pity her, why don't you just marry her now?" Later on, when my grandfather fell gravely ill and the company teetered on the brink, I had no choice but to reveal my pregnancy and take over the family business. "Miss Harper, is this child Marcus Langston's son?" I gave the reporters a sly grin. The baby had nothing to do with Marcus's son. I heard that day. Marcus was so livid when he saw me on TV with a slightly protruding belly that he wrecked everything in his office. Later, someone snapped a photo of the most low-key and enigmatic big shot in the city, charming a woman on a bustling street. "Jackson, the baby's almost a year old and will soon start calling Daddy. When are you going to give me a legit status?" When I swung open the door to the private room, Marcus Langston's son was on one knee, holding a massive diamond ring to propose. But it wasn't to me. Standing before him was a young lady in a white gown, stunningly beautiful and graceful. She was tearfully nodding and crying as she accepted. I walked in, and Marcus didn't even glance my way, focused solely on placing the ring on her finger. It wasn't until she excused herself to the restroom with her bestie to touch up her makeup that Marcus looked at me with indifference. Lily was pure and shy. I had worked hard to win her over. As for our past, it was best kept hidden from Lily. "And she's already agreed to my proposal. I'm planning to announce it tomorrow." I had been in a secret relationship with Marcus for 3 years. Only a few from both families and our close circle knew the details. As soon as he spoke, the few insiders in the room all turned their gazes towards me. I took a deep breath. "Marcus, can you hold off on announcing the engagement for now? Maybe just delay it for a month? No, even 2 weeks?" Marcus laughed, a hint of mockery in his eyes. "Ella, at this point, you're still clinging to me?" "Marcus, for the sake of our past," I pleaded. "Enough." Suddenly, he smashed the wine glass in front of him, his face icy. "For 3 years, the Langston family has covered at least $3 billion of the Harper family's debts. Isn't that enough?" I was left speechless. "Go back so Lily won't misinterpret our relationship when she returns." I turned stiffly. As I opened the door to leave, I heard Marcus tell someone, "If you feel sorry for her, why don't you just marry her now?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. The Harper family had indeed fallen on hard times, especially after my parents passed away, and the company nearly collapsed. But Marcus forgot that it was our struggling Harper family that had saved his and his grandfather's lives years ago. Yet he only resented the Harper family for forcing him into gratitude. He despised me, feeling that the Harper family had forced me upon him. Marcus and Lily's engagement news spread quickly throughout the city. My grandfather, already critically ill from my parents' death, was moved to the ICU. While I stayed by his side day and night, my uncle brought people to raid the company. Before, with the Langston family's influence, they were hesitant to make any bold moves. Now, with me being an orphan without parents, they had no reservations. In a fleeting moment of clarity, my grandfather grabbed my hand and said, "Ella, this company is your parents' lifetime legacy. Even if it's destroyed, it can't fall into the hands of those greedy sharks." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Don't worry, I've got a plan." My uncle insisted that a Harper woman couldn't inherit the business, using this as a pretext to seize everything from the Harper family's main branch. But I refused to let them win. 2 weeks after Marcus announced his engagement, I made the most bizarre yet crucial decision of my life. I needed a child to inherit the Harper family's business. Since I didn't qualify for IVF, I opted for natural conception. As for the father, the butler, who had served my grandfather his entire life, presented me with the final selected information. "Miss, please take a look." The man's details were straightforward. From Brooksville, took his mother's last name, likely from a single-parent household. His academic background was impressive, showcasing high intelligence and good genes. A detailed medical report confirmed he was in excellent health with no hidden ailments. Most importantly, the photo. He was so handsome, it was mesmerizing. "Jake, are you sure someone this outstanding needs to do this kind of work?" I couldn't hide my confusion. Jake smiled warmly, hinting that someone in his family was seriously ill and desperately needed a large sum of money. I thought of my grandfather still in the hospital and felt a pang of sympathy. Add another 50 grand for him. Yes, Brooksville. On the 12th day after Marcus announced his engagement, coinciding with my fertile day, I met a man named Leo Grant. He wore an ordinary black shirt and long pants, no visible brands, likely cheap supermarket clothes. But even in such modest attire, he didn't look cheap. As stated in the contract, his eyes were covered with a black silk ribbon. When I pushed the door open, he instinctively stood up and looked towards the entrance. That's when I noticed he was very tall, at least 6 feet 2 inches, with a strong build, broad shoulders, a slim waist, and long legs. Miss? Leo Grant tentatively spoke. His voice was pleasant, making me feel even more at ease. It's me. Don't sweat it. I walked forward slowly and patted his arm. Did you freshen up? You look great. I had been so nervous that a light sheen of sweat covered my back, but I acted calm and composed. All right, let's get started. Leo couldn't see me, but I could see him. After I said that, his lips curled slightly. Facing me through the black cloth, he nodded slightly. All right, Brooksville. His long fingers began to unbutton his shirt one by one. My face instantly flushed red. I quickly turned around. The sound of clothes rustling stopped. His voice, hoarse and smooth, said, Miss, it's done. I forced myself to appear relaxed and natural as I turned back, but my eyes suddenly widened. The long black silk ribbon fell from his neatly cut hair, partially covering his eyebrows and making his nose look more prominent. Miss? Perhaps because I hadn't spoken for a while, Leo softly called out. He took a step forward, reaching out as if searching for something. His fingertips touched my shoulder. Overstepping slightly, he gently held my shoulder. In the next moment, he lifted me up horizontally, and my body sank onto the soft bed. My heart pounded so fast I felt dizzy and could barely breathe. Leo lowered his head, the black silk ribbon slipping, sliding across my collarbone. His cool fingers cupped my face, kissing lightly on my neck. Just as he leaned in closer, my phone suddenly rang. Leo instinctively stopped. I straightened up and reached for my phone. To my surprise, it was Marcus Langston's son calling. I hesitated for a moment but then hung up. However, the call came through again swiftly. My gaze fell on Leo's face beside me. His lips were thin, and I'd heard that guys like him are naturally detached. I was momentarily stunned, but detachment was good. Detachment suited this arrangement better. After parting ways, there would be no further entanglements. I pressed the answer button. Marcus's voice sounded somewhat unfamiliar in my ear. Ella, why didn't you tell me Grandpa was hospitalized? It wasn't a secret. So, where are you now? I'll come get you, and we'll go to the hospital to see Grandpa together. No need. Grandpa was always good to me. I want to ensure he finds peace during this time. I responded, No thanks for your kindness. Ella, you should know not to go overboard when throwing a fit, right? Marcus's voice was tinged with barely concealed anger. I understood him. For someone as arrogant and conceited as he was to call me and show goodwill was rare. But it was unnecessary. After all, it was already too late. I clutched my phone and looked at the man in front of me, Marcus. Before I could finish, Leo suddenly spoke in a deep, husky voice. Miss? A passionate kiss landed on the corner of my lips. The phone slipped from my grasp and hit the floor. I frowned and let out a quiet groan of pain. Marcus's voice echoed, fragmented, and chaotic. Ella? Who the hell are you with? The screen went dark. Leo leaned down, exceptionally gentle, yet overwhelmingly forceful. He kissed my lips. What followed was natural. Leo was considerate of my feelings, so gentle it felt like he was the lover he cherished. In the middle of it, I had a moment of unconsciousness. I didn't realize it, but Leo had removed the silk blindfold covering his eyes. In the dimly lit bedroom, he looked at my face, kissing down from my brow inch by inch. The next morning, when I opened my eyes, I found myself dressed in clean, soft pajamas. The other side of the bed was empty, as if everything that happened last night was just a dream. I struggled to get up and wash, and when I went downstairs for breakfast, Jake told me that Leo had left last night as per the contract. I sat at the dining table, thinking about his boldness last night and how I had lost control and followed him into the unknown. The nape of my neck felt a bit warm. Did you give him the money? According to the agreement, 1/3 has been paid, and the rest will be given once you confirm the pregnancy. I nodded and didn't say more. At the Intercontinental Hotel, Leo had long changed out of his cheap clothes. He had finished swimming in the private pool on the top floor. The butler from the old house was already waiting in the living room. Madam knows you're in the city these days and wants you to have dinner together tonight. Leo casually tossed the towel aside and chuckled. Her intentions aren't what they seem. You'll be 28 after the new year. No wonder she's anxious. Leo walked to the fridge and nonchalantly grabbed a bottle of water. His damp black hair was casually swept back, revealing a square forehead and long, slanted eyebrows. What's the rush? In a few days, she might become a grandma. Leo took a sip of water and joked with the butler who had watched him grow up. The butler was startled. My dear young master, you can't play such a big game. Our Fisher and Grant families have only you as the heir. The future young master or miss will be more precious than gold. How can you be so casual? The future young mistress must marry with proper ceremonies. I know, of course. Leo sat on the sofa, his eyes lowered to the still visible bite mark on his left arm. Thinking of that night, a gentle expression spread across his face. Things don't always go as planned. My period was just a day late, but it still came as usual. I came out of the bathroom and sat on the sofa, feeling a bit down. The turmoil outside was escalating, and Grandpa had slipped into a deep coma. The doctor said he could hold on for at most a month. I called Jake over. Get in touch with Leo Grant. Next month, let's try again. Yes, Brooksville. I stood up and took a few steps towards the door, but then paused and looked back at Jake. Make sure to explain the rules to him clearly. If it weren't for the fact that I didn't want to face another unfamiliar man again, I probably wouldn't seek out Leo Grant again. After all, that night he had crossed the line multiple times. The day before meeting Leo again, I bumped into Marcus Langston's son at a party. To my surprise, he wasn't with his fiancée Lily. As soon as I saw him from a distance, I looked away. Today was Mrs. Thompson's birthday, a family friend. I chose to attend to reconnect with my parents' old acquaintances. However, it was clear I was being naive. I had long understood the saying, out of sight, out of mind, but today's experience made it even more obvious. Although my relationship with Marcus was a secret, no secret lasts forever. During those 3 years, it was only because of the Langston family's influence that I had any leverage. But now that Marcus had announced his engagement, I was just an orphan with no support. Who would still look at me kindly? My raised wine glass awkwardly hovered in the air for a long time. It was only then that Mrs. Thompson seemed to notice me and clinked her glass with mine. But clearly she had no intention of making small talk. Naturally, I didn't embarrass myself. After the toast, I moved to a quiet corner. Being treated so coldly and without face made my mood utterly terrible. Unknowingly, I drank a few more glasses. I hadn't noticed when Marcus approached. Ella Langston! He looked at me with his usual superior air, but I no longer tried to cautiously maintain my relationship with him as I did before. Mr. Langston's son. I greeted him coolly and was about to leave. Marcus stopped me. Ella, I visited Grandpa a few days ago. His condition isn't good. Yes, the doctor had informed me. I've also heard about the recent troubles with the Harper family. What did Marcus want? I looked at him calmly yet distantly. In my youth, I was truly naive and foolish. I thought that since we had known each other since childhood and grown up together, and since the Harper family had been so kind to his family, he would surely treat me well. But I completely ignored the fact that if a man doesn't like you, no amount of kindness can bind him. And our Harper family expecting gratitude in return was also a petty act. In the end, Marcus didn't really owe me anything. After all, love cannot be forced. Marcus slowly took a step forward and gently held my hand. Ella, if you weren't so stubborn, I might have helped you. Help me? Yes, after all, your Grant family saved my grandfather and me. Marcus chuckled. I've been waiting for you to give in these past few days. Ella, after all these years of our relationship, I wouldn't really ignore your life and death. Marcus, just say it straight. What do you want? I won't marry you, but we can maintain our previous relationship. I looked at Marcus with some surprise. After all, that night he proposed to Lily with such sincerity and deep affection. It was truly moving. So it was all just an act. You already have a fiance, so what? In our circle, who doesn't have a close friend? Marcus looked at me arrogantly and confidently. Ella, given the Harper family's current situation, you know what choice to make. Being with me will only benefit you. I interrupted him with disgust. Before today, I didn't actually hate you at all. On the contrary, I was reflecting on how our Harper family was being petty and leveraging our kindness to force you. But now I don't think that way anymore. You're nothing but a complete jerk. If our Harper family knew that the person they saved was an ungrateful fool and a total idiot, they would definitely regret their act of kindness. Ella, venting your anger won't do you any good. Think about your parents' hard work. If the company really falls into your hands and is ruined, how would they feel if they knew? If my parents knew I had to be your mistress to save the company, they wouldn't forgive me even in the afterlife. Ella, you'd better think it through. You know I won't give you a third chance. I grabbed my wine glass and splashed it directly on his face. Get lost. Marcus's face turned livid, clearly furious. I was even prepared for him to hit me. After all, someone like him who had always been favored had never been treated this way. Ella, I'll wait for the day you regret it. The day you come back crying and begging me. After saying that, Marcus turned and walked away. There were murmurs of discussion all around. I stood there, as if I hadn't heard anything, and walked outside. As soon as I got in the car, Jake's call came through. Miss, the person has been picked up. Got it. I'm heading back now. I hung up the phone and saw Jake's call again. Miss, the person has been picked up. Got it. I'm heading back now. I hung up and looked at the pitch-black sky outside the car window. If I couldn't get pregnant tonight, I really wouldn't have much time left. The car stopped in front of the villa. The light in my bedroom was already on. I got out of the car, refusing any help, and staggered up the stairs alone. Leo Grant was sitting quietly on the sofa with his eyes covered, just like last time. I pushed the door open and leaned against it, eyeing him drunkenly. Tonight, probably because I had drunk a lot, my emotions suddenly spiraled out of control. Miss? Leo must have heard me push the door. He turned his face towards me, looking through the silk band covering his eyes. I walked towards him step by step, my gaze also falling on his face and body. The air was filled with a faint, refreshing scent of post-bath cleanliness. The clothes he was wearing were obviously not his own, likely prepared by Jake. They were clearly high quality and suited him well. Leo stood up. He was a full head taller than me, especially now, as I kicked off my high heels. Standing in front of him, I felt somewhat insignificant. I slightly stood on tiptoe and grabbed his lapel. Leo Grant, who gave you permission to kiss me? Who allowed you? Miss? You still remember I'm the miss, your benefactor? Leo seemed to laugh lightly. Yes, Miss is right. I overstepped. Dare to do it again? I wouldn't dare. I patted his face with satisfaction. You're obedient, I like that. As long as Miss is happy. But I let go of him and took a step back, looking him up and down. Are you impotent? Otherwise, why haven't I gotten pregnant? I saw Leo freeze for a moment. I'm giving you one last chance. If I still can't get pregnant this time, Leo Grant, I'm gonna have to find someone else to replace you. If there were a regret pill in this world, I would never have let myself speak recklessly that night, especially not to question a man's abilities. The consequence was that entire night, Leo Grant almost wore me out. He not only kissed me countless times, but also forced me to kiss him back. If it weren't for me crying and begging him pitifully at the end, he might not have let me go. But the effect of that night was clear. Grandpa was announced critical again. When the side branches of the Harper family blocked me at the company, forcing me to hand over the company seal, I directly contacted the media and held a press conference. At the press conference, I publicly revealed my pregnancy report and declared that the child would take my Harper surname and inherit the business left by my parents. After a brief interview with the reporters, I received a call from Marcus Langston's son. He was obviously furious on the phone, his voice hoarse. Ella Harper, I've never touched you. Where did the child in your belly come from? Is this a scheme you orchestrated on purpose? I could understand Marcus's anger. After all, counting the days, I was 5 weeks pregnant today, and it had only been 3 months since we broke up. Of course you never touched me, and I never said the child's father was you. I walked into the elevator, looking at myself in the mirror. Marcus Langston's son, we broke up long ago. Our matters have nothing to do with each other anymore. Please don't call me again in the future. Ella, are you really pregnant? Who is the father? Tell me clearly. I didn't answer. After hanging up the phone, I deleted his number immediately. From now on, this would be my biggest secret. That man named Leo Grant had already taken the money I gave him and returned to Brooksville. We would never meet again in this lifetime. In May of the following year, I gave birth to my eldest son, Colin Harper, in the city. Contrary to what I'd imagined, he didn't look much like me. Jake said Colin's brows, eyes, and jawline looked exactly like Leo Grant's. When I looked at him, I often felt dazed. Back then, I had Leo blindfolded so he wouldn't know what I looked like, so he wouldn't recognize my identity. But Jake had seen him. Since he said so, it couldn't be false. So, Leo Grant's brows and eyes were like this. Even though he was blindfolded, I could vaguely see that he was very handsome. And a man like him, once out of his predicament, would have a boundless future. For such a past that couldn't see the light of day, he must want to forget it even more than I do. So, I didn't need to worry about him suddenly coming back to fight for the child, nor did I need to worry about meeting him again. But every time I saw Colin, I still thought of those 2 nights. In this life, maybe he would be the only man I ever had. Maybe I would only have those 2 nights of joy. At Colin's 1-month celebration, the mysterious Fisher family from the city sent a valuable gift. I was somewhat surprised. Even the prosperous Langston family couldn't compare, let alone the Harper family, which was no longer as influential as it used to be. There had never been any interaction between the Harper and Fisher families, and it was impossible for us to associate with them. Why would the Fisher family send such a valuable gift? What surprised me even more was that at Colin's 100-day celebration, Mrs. Fisher herself visited. She even invited me to a small gathering 3 days later. I felt very anxious, but also very puzzled. However, Mrs. Fisher was a very gentle and kind elder, and she seemed to have no ill intentions towards me. Especially towards Colin, she was very fond of him. During her visit, besides giving me a gift, she also prepared a generous 100-day gift for Colin. When she left, Mrs. Fisher held Colin lovingly, reluctant to let go, looking back several times with longing. This made me even more suspicious. So, when I went to the appointment 3 days later, I specifically asked Jake to stay at home to look after Colin. Then, I took my assistant and driver to Mrs. Fisher's private club. As soon as my car stopped, several people eagerly came up to greet me. "Miss Harper, please come in. Our madam has been waiting for you." "Yes, madam instructed us to wait for your car outside." "Thank you for your trouble." I smiled and thanked them, following them to the flower hall. Unexpectedly, I saw a dark gray Bentley, slowly stopping not far away. The driver rushed to open the door. A tall man got out of the car. Through a row of flower trees, I could only vaguely see a side silhouette. My heart skipped a beat for no reason. Even though I had never seen Leo Grant in daylight or bright light, this silhouette seemed inexplicably familiar at first glance. Then, I couldn't help but deny it in my heart. Leo Grant was from Brooksville. His mother was also from Brooksville. Back then, Jake chose him precisely because he wasn't from the city, but far away in Brooksville. He wouldn't suddenly appear in the city, but the city doesn't belong to the Harper family, and I didn't have the power to keep Leo Grant from setting foot here for a lifetime. Even if he came to the city, it wouldn't be surprising. But could it be him? "Miss Harper?" Someone beside me called softly. I snapped back to reality and quickly followed their steps. "Does Mrs. Fisher have other guests today?" The person in front of me smiled warmly. "It's our young master who just returned to the city," pointing to the Bentley. "That's the young master's car." So the person just now was Mrs. Fisher's only son. Mrs. Fisher had also married into the Fisher family from Brooksville to the city. Her only son naturally bore the surname Fisher, so it wasn't Leo Grant. I breathed a sigh of relief. But inexplicably, I felt a bit of indescribable disappointment. This disappointment made me laugh at myself. Why should I feel disappointed? Could it be that deep down, I was still hoping to meet Leo Grant? It was just a transaction between us. Once the transaction ended, it should have been completely over. Thinking this, I still felt somewhat dazed. When I entered the flower hall, I heard some laughter inside. It was probably Mrs. Fisher talking to her son. I instinctively looked up and met the man's eyes. They were eyes I had never seen before, but they seemed as if I had seen them countless times. My heart stopped for a moment. "Miss Harper is here." Mrs. Fisher got up with a smile and came over, holding my hand and leading me to sit down. She then instructed the servant to serve tea. "Leo, this is Miss Harper." Mrs. Fisher looked at her son and then at me, smiling even more. "Miss Harper, this is my unworthy son. Miss Harper, I've heard so much about you." Leo Fisher walked up to me, extending his hand. My heart started beating rapidly, gradually intensifying. My mind was still blank, but a buzzing sound began to ring in my ears. I didn't respond politely, nor did I extend my hand to shake his. Instead, I somewhat rudely looked at Mrs. Fisher. "Mrs. Fisher? What did you just call him?" Mrs. Fisher was a little surprised, but still smiled and said, "His name is Leo. Leo Fisher." I blankly repeated, "Leo Fisher?" I looked at the man in front of me. His build was almost identical to Leo Grant's, if his brows and eyes were covered, leaving only his nose and lips exposed. My body suddenly swayed lightly. "Miss Harper?" Leo Fisher quickly reached out to support me, but I pushed him away. I raised my hand and gently covered his eyes. Exactly the same. I remembered our first night together. I had thought then that Leo Grant's lips were a bit thin, and people said men with thin lips were ruthless. But to me, being ruthless was good. Being ruthless suited this transaction better. But if Leo Fisher was Leo Grant, why did he deceive me like this? He was clearly born with a silver spoon in his mouth, an unattainable wealthy young master. Yet he pretended to be a poor student, even entered into such an absurd transaction with me. Fine, even if he was seeking amusement, finding it fun and exciting. Once the transaction ended, we would part ways completely. Why did he suddenly appear in front of me again, suddenly involve himself in my and my child's life? At this moment, I seemed to understand why the Fisher family sent a full moon gift, why Mrs. Fisher personally visited on Colin's 100th day, and why she loved Colin so much. Because they all knew Colin was Leo Fisher's child. They wanted to take my child away. When my hand fell from covering Leo Fisher's eyes, tears suddenly broke free. Leo Fisher was clearly flustered. "Ella?" He instinctively raised his hand to wipe my tears, but I pushed his hand away. "Sorry, I'm not feeling well. I'd like to go back." "Miss Harper, you don't look well. Let Leo take you home." I raised my hand to wipe away my tears. Looking at Leo Fisher in front of me, I couldn't help but laugh. "Should I call you Leo Fisher or Leo Grant?" "Ella," he replied. I didn't stay any longer, grabbed my bag, and turned to leave. Mrs. Fisher and Leo Fisher both chased after me, but I didn't want to stop for even a moment. All of this was too sudden. I couldn't accept it. I felt like a clown kept in the dark. "Ella, can you listen to me for a few words?" Leo Fisher grabbed my wrist. Without thinking, I shook him off. If I remember correctly, the contract was very clear. After the transaction ended, there shouldn't be any ties between us. You took the money. You have to abide by the agreement. "Mr. Fisher, I don't care if you're Leo Grant or Leo Fisher. Our relationship ended completely last year. I don't care what you want to do by suddenly appearing in front of me now." I took a deep breath, gradually calming down. In short, I have only one thing to say. The child is mine. His surname is Harper, and he has nothing to do with you. No one should think of taking him from me. "Ella, I never intended to take the child." "Fine. Since that's the case, then it's my fault for being suspicious. Pretend I didn't say anything. Can I go home now?" Maybe my state was really too bad. Leo Fisher didn't stop me anymore. Mrs. Fisher later called me several times, but I never answered. Leo Fisher also stopped visiting the Harper family. I didn't see him. Colin grew up day by day just as Jake said. His eyebrows and eyes looked exactly like Leo Fisher's. And I also learned some things about Leo Fisher from Jake. He is the only son of his parents. In both his maternal and paternal families, he is the only child. He has two identities. In Brooksville, he is Leo Grant of the Grant family. In the city, he is Leo Fisher of the Fisher family. Actually, it wasn't really deception from the beginning. Leo Grant is indeed his real name. But thinking back to those scant memories, I felt embarrassed. He is the only young master of both the Grant and Fisher families. Back then, I even felt sorry for him, wanting to give him an extra $500,000 as compensation. When he got the money, did he laugh at my foolishness? Sometimes I really can't understand. A person like him who can have any woman and seek any thrill. Why did he choose to toy with me? He said he had no intention of taking the child away, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that. Both the Fisher and Grant families have few descendants. Even if Leo Fisher doesn't care about the child, the elders of both families might not feel the same. What if they really wanted to fight me for the child? I didn't dare to imagine the consequences, because the consequences were obvious. It would be like an ant trying to stop a carriage. Although I refused to meet with anyone from the Fisher family, Leo Fisher still silently permeated my life. The Fisher family indeed didn't show any intention of fighting me for Colin. On the contrary, the gifts they sent for me and Colin were almost daily and unending. Even if I refused to accept them and shut them out, they still persisted. Sometimes even Jake would try to persuade me. He said, for a family like the Fishers to lower themselves in this way is truly rare. When he said that, Leo Fisher was waiting downstairs. The city's September was still unbearably hot. It was almost noon, and the sun was scorching. Leo's forehead was sweaty, his suit jacket draped over his arm, and the back of his shirt was soaked. Miss, I always feel that the Fisher family doesn't have any underhanded thoughts. And this Mr. Fisher, he doesn't seem like a bad person either. Jake looked downstairs, seeming a bit sympathetic. Miss, you've seen it yourself over the past month. Honestly, with Mr. Fisher's background, if he really wanted to do something, why would he go through so much trouble? I couldn't help but look downstairs. Leo had been standing there for almost 2 hours. The heat was still intense. If something really happened to him, thinking of Colin, thinking of his identical eyebrows and eyes. In the end, I softened. I invited him in and asked the kitchen to prepare some cooling tea. I spoke gently, my gaze falling on Leo's handsome and dignified face. After a while, I finally looked away. I'll go down later and have a good talk with him. Jake happily went downstairs while I sat upstairs for a moment. I changed into a dress and went down. Leo was sitting in the living room drinking tea. When he saw me coming down, he put down his teacup and stood up. Miss Harper. And I asked the servants to leave and got straight to the point. Mr. Fisher, let's have a good talk today. What exactly do you and Mrs. Fisher want with all this? Leo looked at me without speaking for a long time. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the birds in the cage under the eaves occasionally chirped lazily. In the distance, it seemed like Colin was crying, but then it stopped, and everything was silent. The air conditioning was on in the house, but I felt a mess inside, unbearably restless. Just when I couldn't stand it anymore and was about to ask him to leave again, Leo suddenly spoke. Miss Harper, I want to marry you, in a formal ceremony with a grand procession. I was stunned. The teacup in my hand almost fell to the ground. But Leo continued, Miss Harper, this idea is not a spur of the moment, nor a decision made after weighing the pros and cons. Then what is it? I asked. Leo smiled faintly. Ella, do you remember, 20 years ago, you and Mr. Harper saved some people at sea? Of course I remember, but I was only a few years old at the time. Later, Grandpa often talked about it, so I remember it to this day. And Marcus Langston's son and his grandfather were the ones our private yacht rescued. I was also among those saved, but Grandpa never mentioned you because I was taken out to sea by a cousin at the time. He was afraid our family would find out and hold him accountable, so he hid my identity. I was only 8 years old then, terrified at sea, almost losing my life. In the end, I only remembered that the yacht had a Harper name on it. As Leo said this, his voice suddenly softened. And also, a very small, very cute little girl gave me a cup of hot water. Ella, I have never changed this idea all these years. I want to find that girl and marry her. Leo had been gone for a long time, but my mind was still in turmoil. I called Jake into the study. Jake, how did you find Leo in the first place? Miss, actually, Leo Grant approached me first. Jake seemed a bit hesitant to look at me. At that time, I had already picked out 2 candidates for you and was about to send the information over. But Leo Grant's profile and resume were so impeccable that I was privately very partial to him. So I added him to the list. I didn't expect you to choose him too. I felt both exasperated and amused. He was indeed confident. Didn't he ever consider what if I hadn't chosen him? It was then that I remembered I had indeed seen his photo back then. In the documents Jake sent over, there was his ID photo. I was really attracted to his face at first glance. Jake, what do you think I should do now? Miss, you're not even 25 yet. When you said you wouldn't get married again, I was actually against it in my heart. You're still so young, with plenty of youth ahead of you. If Mr. Fisher is sincere, you might as well give it a try with him. Besides, the Fisher family doesn't intend to take the child away. They seem very earnest to me. Jake sighed affectionately. I know you were hurt by the Langston family and that scoundrel Marcus Langston, but there are still good men in the world, aren't there? But he lied to me. Why didn't he come to me directly and say he wanted to repay us? He had many ways to repay the favor. Why did he have to do it like this? Jake couldn't help but laugh. It's because you were too hasty, Ella. If Mr. Fisher hadn't intervened back then, you would have chosen someone else and things would have been set in stone. This was a stopgap measure. Mr. Fisher was afraid he would miss the chance and regret it for life. I grabbed a pillow and buried my face in it. But I'm just angry, and I hate him. Why should I give him a chance? Even if I want to date someone, it might not be with him. There are plenty of good-looking, excellent men in the city. Jake couldn't help but chuckle. All right, miss, you can date whoever you want. But despite saying that, Jake still sided with him once. As soon as there was any sign of movement on my end, Leo would know immediately. Even when I was just sitting in a cafe with a date, Leo's Bentley would be parked on the street. Although neither of us was married. For some reason, when his car stopped, I felt like I was caught red-handed. Leo didn't disturb me. He didn't even get out of the car. But I felt uneasy and had to come up with an excuse to send my date away first. As the sky darkened, I picked up my bag and walked out. Leo got out of the car too. The streetlights began to illuminate one by one in the twilight, and he was bathed in the shimmering light. I deliberately pretended not to see him. I walked straight along the street. I didn't look back even when I reached the intersection. But I knew he was definitely following me. When the green light came on, and I was about to cross the crosswalk, Leo gently grabbed my wrist from behind. A cyclist sped past me. Leo pulled me in front of him. Winter had arrived in the city. He was wearing a navy blue thin trench coat, and I was wrapped in it entirely. Ella, he called my name softly. As the night breeze blew, he raised his hand to tidy my messy hair. I noticed someone around seemed to be secretly taking photos. In fact, in recent days, I had heard all sorts of rumors about the Fisher family and Leo Fisher. He spent most of his time in Brooksville, and when he was in the city, he was always very low-key and mysterious, with unpredictable whereabouts. But lately, he had been visiting my house too frequently. So much so that he caught the attention of gossipers and paparazzi. Leo, it seems someone is taking photos. I tried to push him away, but he simply let go of my wrist and directly hugged my waist. Ella. He lowered his head slightly and coaxed softly in my ear. Colin is almost 1 year old. He will soon start calling Daddy. When will you give me a proper status? Those photos and videos were spreading like wildfire in the city. Some people with too much time on their hands even started lip-reading Leo to figure out what he was saying to me at the moment. Even Marcus Langston's son came to the Harper family once. It was really strange. He loved Lily so much back then, but it had been almost 2 years since they announced their engagement, and they still hadn't had the wedding. I met him in the living room. Marcus got straight to the point. Is the child Leo Fisher's? I didn't answer and asked him back. What does it have to do with you? Ella, Leo Fisher comes from an excellent background, and both the Fisher family and his maternal family have only him as their sole heir. What do you think his purpose is in approaching you? He just wants to take the child away. Whether it is or isn't, what does it have to do with you? Ella, I'm thinking for your sake, afraid you'll be deceived and end up suffering. What can he deceive me about? What if he wants to take Colin and change his surname back to Fisher? You're overthinking it. Leo arrived quickly, thanks to Jake tipping him off again. I leaned back on the soft sofa. comfortably sipping hot tea. Leo walked into the living room, covered in wind and snow. The servant quickly brought his favorite Dragonwell tea. He sat down beside me, looking at ease as if he were at home. Marcus's face showed some embarrassment, but he still insisted. Is it possible Mr. Fisher doesn't have such thoughts? Colin is your child, and a son at that. Even if you don't want to take him away, wouldn't the elders of the Fisher and Grant families? I held the teacup, watching the tea leaves float and sink. This was a point of curiosity for me, too. But I had never asked Leo. Leo lowered his head to drink tea, the crisp sound of the cup lid clinking. The warmth inside contrasted with the heavy snow outside. I put down the cup and looked at the snowy scene. But then, Leo held my hand. Colin will always carry his mother's surname. It won't change. When he said this, Marcus looked shocked. Leo Fisher, can you really do that? I couldn't help but look at him too. Time will tell. Anyone can say nice things and make promises, but who can keep them? Marcus's face turned even darker. Leo chuckled lightly. Indeed, anyone can make promises. Mr. Langston's son, you and your grandfather should know this best. Marcus's face gradually turned pale. Yes, his grandfather had once promised everything. In the end, it all came to nothing. When Grandpa entrusted me to him, he also promised to take good care of me and help guard the Harper family. But in the end, I felt relieved. Finally, at this moment, completely relieved. We hope for returns, so we end up utterly disappointed. When we expect nothing in return, God gives us the best arrangement. For example, he sent Leo to my side. After my marriage with Leo was settled, he naturally started staying at the Harper house. Still the same bedroom, still the same tranquil nights. The only difference was Leo's face was no longer covered with a black silk band. We both had a little to drink. A bit tipsy, I pushed him onto the sofa and looked at him seriously for the first time. What are you thinking about? Wondering why you're doing this? A life-saving grace that can't be repaid, of course, I can only offer myself. Offering yourself is a loss for me, isn't it? Leo laughed, hugging me and resting his chin on my neck. Ella, it's my fault. Of course it's your fault. You don't know how much I disliked you. You don't know how much I love you? Are you really letting Colin take my surname? Of course, what if I don't want to have more children in the future? Then we won't have any. But the Fisher and Grant families only have you as a child. We have Colin, but his surname is Harper. Does it matter? Leo lowered his head and kissed me lightly. Isn't he still my child? Doesn't he carry the blood of the Fisher and Grant families? Few people can think so clearly. Everyone cares about different things. I couldn't help but smile, holding his face just like that night, and asked him, Have you bathed? Yes, Ella. Then take off your clothes. He also smiled, pulled me up, and then stood up. In the warm house, Leo raised his hand and unbuttoned his shirt. The hem of his shirt was swiftly pulled out, followed by the belt. But this time, I didn't look away. I watched until the end. He coughed lightly, his heated gaze sliding over my face. Ella, girls should still be a bit reserved. I laughed and threw myself into his arms. Are you shy? Leo caught me steadily and whispered in my ear, Ella, this time can I kiss you? I didn't answer but stood on tiptoe and kissed him.